Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 56, and today we're going to talk about my first body recovery as a diver. Of course, that goes with the usual warnings. We'll get pretty graphic because unfortunately these things tend to be pretty unpleasant, but I suspect if you're returning then you'll be quite used to it. And if this is your first time here, hi and welcome. You might want to go back to previous episodes, maybe start from the beginning, as we're quite a few episodes in now. Following my 28-year career in the police, this is a series of short stories about some of the things that I dealt with and some of the things that happened to me. So firstly, a couple of things. Thank you very much for the downloads. Downloads have exploded this week. I can't really explain why. I'm not sure why it's a massive increase. I was looking forward to hitting the 10,000 download mark this week, but to be honest with you, we smashed it, and we're pushing on to 11,000 downloads, which is just incredible. It never ceases to surprise me. It had some good comments and questions on podcasts, on YouTube, so thank you for that. The other thing that's changed is the recording's going to be done in a slightly different area from now on account of I've sold my caravan, my would-be recording studio, so it's a little bit more echoey in here. Let me know what you think. Hopefully it doesn't affect it too much. So we'll get on. Oh, and one final thing, and I hate to say this because this is only, I think, the second time I've said this since I've started the podcast, so I don't think I'm being over the top with it, but I have set up a buy me a coffee thing. If you go on to buy me a coffee, Police Stories Podcast, you can have the option of buying me a coffee for a couple of quid for £2, just if you appreciate what I'm doing. And again, a couple of people have gone on, so thank you for that, and bought me 2 or 3 coffees. But yes, feel free to go on and show your appreciation with buying me a coffee if you want. I can't guarantee it'll be a coffee. I might even have a beer. You never know. Depends how much, if anything, I get. But that's the end of that, because it makes me cringe, to be honest with you, asking for anything. But right, okay, so we're going to get on today. So first body recovery. Obviously, we've talked about the diving so far and the courses that lead up to it, and we obviously touched on the process of searching for a large item like a body last week. But specifically, we're going to deal with the first one that I dealt with. Now, it is a big deal for a diver to find their first one. And, when you first come onto the dive team, obviously there was a lot of experienced people there, and they would talk of previous jobs they'd had, and you kind of wanted to not be accepted, but, you wanted to be part of the gang. You wanted to be an accepted, experienced diver, who had carried out his role. I'm not sure it's the best analogy, but soldiers quite often say, they train, do all this training, and then perhaps some of them never go to combat or war, in their career, and they kind of want to, terrible as it is, just to prove that they're a professional soldier. And I guess perhaps it's similar. Perhaps I'm just rambling aimlessly, as I obviously do quite often, but if you're a police diver, you want to recover things, whether it's murder weapons, bodies, cars, whatever it is, that is your job. So you want to carry out your job. You've done a lot of training, and the police have put a lot of faith in you and putting you through that training, to get you to a standard. So it's certainly something you want to be competent at, for sure. Now, because I think we talked about the diver rotation before, divers are numbered 1 to 10. I was number 6. So when you were diving, it was in this strict rotation. So, if the last diver was diver 5, it didn't matter whether it was a horrible pond search for something really nasty, or whether it was a clean gravel pit with a bit of visibility. If the last diver was diver 5, I was the next diver, and that way it just made it fairer. And because of that, it would mean that you could regularly find yourself being the diver or a diver on a job where we were looking for a body. But it didn't necessarily mean you were going to find the body. So several times I've been to jobs where we've been looking for bodies. But don't forget, we'd also talked about, if I'm the supervisor or the dive supervisor who's directing me where to start from, invariably you'll put in an overlap. So you will start the person sort of way beyond or way before where we think the body might be. So there's every chance that that first diver won't be the one to find it. It might be the second or third diver who will actually get the body. And some people that came onto the unit, I think I'd probably been on about 6 months at the point of this incident we're going to talk about, but certainly colleagues of mine, some of them went, maybe 2 years before they had their first body, yet they'd been the diver on perhaps 10 different occasions, for searches, but they'd just never actually been the one in the water that found it, And I think for one in particular that we'll talk about a bit later, it became a bit of a thing, almost a running joke, if you can have jokes about these things, but in the police you have to have jokes about these things, that, we would wind him up that he just wasn't a very good diver, so he wasn't finding things, because that's what the police do. And, unfortunately, it doesn't matter what the content is, you have to have that banter, that light-heartedness to sort of get through these things. Anyway, so onto this job. It was a call out. Generally, we worked kind of, 7 in the morning till I think it was 5 at night. And anything that happened sort of out with those hours would be a call out. Now, we talked again last week that we weren't a rescue service, we were recovery. It took us, a lot of the guys and girls lived, anything up to 2 hours away from the base. So if you got a phone call at home at 11 o'clock at night to say, come in, you weren't getting in till 1 o'clock in the morning. And then you had to, get all the kit, get the lorry, load it up, get the cylinders that have been filled up from the previous day's diving with air, and all this stuff. And then you had to travel through central London to get to the place, minimum of another hour. So from getting the phone call to actually turning up at the dive site could easily be 3 hours. So you can see why, we were not a rescue team. That didn't happen. And the other thing to mention is quite often we see on the news, you see fire brigades, or even paramedics that have their own boats, canoes, kayaks and things like that will help out on body searches. But there's fairly strict guidelines as to kind of whose it was. And it's not that we're not letting other people play with our ball, but for example, the fire brigade in London were not trained divers. They had breathing apparatus, which certainly looks very similar to, sort of full face dive masks. But they were not dive masks, and they were not qualified or trained to dive. So generally, anything on the surface, so if you had a body on the surface, that might well be a normal marine unit call out that would go and recover the body from a dinghy, or it might be the fire brigade, or even a push or a paramedics or someone like that, maybe a volunteer sort of lifeguardy type team would go and recover that body from the surface. But the moment it went below the surface, or that a witness said, I last saw the person there and now they disappeared, that's a dive job. And occasionally it causes a few issues. I remember certainly having a couple of robust conversations with sort of fire brigade types that had turned up with parking their big fire trucks in the way and saying, this is our scene, leave it to us. And you'd be like, okay, right, are you going to put divers in? Well, no, we haven't got divers. Okay, so how are you going to find this person? Because they're not on the surface, and we're at last told, that they left the surface at, an hour ago or whatever. So you'd have to sort of make it clear as to whose scene it was as such, who had ownership of that, if you like. The other thing we see regularly, and it always makes me chuckle, is fire brigade or other teams with big, long, pokey sticks. Now, I can tell you from doing quite a few searches, when you walk through your average, swampy pond, the bottom is very soft and muddy. If I'm walking through there with sticks poking on the bottom, if I poke it on a body, I'm afraid a squishy body feels very similar to a squishy, sort of muddy bottom that's on the pond anyway. So what we end up doing, and we've had it a few times, you recover, bodies to find that they have holes poked in them. And then coroners, ask questions why. Well, quite often it's the sticks from, sort of teams that have gone through searching for bodies. But, especially if the body's been there a while, they're quite fragile. So the thing is, you can't tell the difference between poking the stick on a body or a soft bottom. But I get that, you firstly need to be seen to do something if someone's gone missing. And secondly, people are, generally trying to help. If we were doing a wave search, not a dive for a body, then we would be expecting pretty much to trip over it, as opposed to with sticks. If we had sticks with us, it was to save us falling over in the sticky mud, not to sort of necessarily find somebody. Anyway, so this call came late at night. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and that causes its own issues. Now people go, oh, wasn't it much more difficult to dive at night? How could you see? You have to remember, all our diving, virtually all our diving, was in nil vis. You couldn't see anything anyway. So the fact you were diving at night made absolutely no difference to us at all. The only difference it made was on the surface, you know, when you were trying to get kitted up and when you were dealing with anything at the sort of the riverbank or at the pond's edge. That's all much more difficult in the dark, of course, you know, so we had to have decent lighting, but the actual diving process and being in the water, in dark water, not being able to see anything is, you know, is by the by. It was something we did all the time anyway, so it made no difference. So yeah, 11 o'clock at night, I had to call, move out to these, we got the team together and we drove out to some swimming ponds in London, of which there are quite a few places where, you know, they are effectively ponds or lakes, but it's safe to swim in, and then generally they kind of rope off areas and they have lifeguards during the day and what have you. But this was slightly unusual in that a group of friends had got together. It was April, but there'd been a heat wave. I think it'd been like 25, 30 degrees, even in April unusually. So it was very, very warm. And of course, what you then have is lots of people, kids, adults, you know, throwing themselves in every bit of water available, canals or all sorts, just to cool down. So unfortunately, our workload did increase during that time. But on this occasion, these four friends had got together, one of whom was visiting from New York. Now, this lad was 17 and he couldn't swim, but him and his pals, you know, had decided to go for a dip in these ponds. Unfortunately, they'd gone after hours, after it had closed officially. So there was no lifeguards, and equally where they were swimming was an area that was sort of not inside the sort of approved roped off area, so it was deemed to be safe. There was no obstructions, it wasn't too deep, you know, and all the rest of it. So they'd gone in a relatively uncleared, potentially dangerous area after hours with no lifeguards, and unfortunately this particular 17-year-old couldn't swim either. But I guess peer pressure, you know, and the heat made him get in thinking perhaps, I don't know, you know, he would just have a dip, he would just have a paddle, he would just go up to his waist or something. I'm not really sure what the thought process was, but unfortunately it was to prove to be fatal. And I believe that there was a post that was sort of stuck in the water that was maybe 30 metres out from the edge of the bank, and I think they decided to swim out to this post and back, or maybe it was a race, something like that. Now, I'm not quite sure how this lad thought he was going to do that, because he couldn't swim. I mean, initially it was quite shallow, you know, sort of maybe, you know, halfway up your legs or something like that. So perhaps he thought you could just wade out, but unfortunately it did drop off a bit. Although certainly in the bit we were in, it never got that deep. It was never deeper than about 2 metres or something like that. But 2 metres is 6'6", and, you know, there isn't many people that are 6'6" and could keep their head out of the water in that scenario. And for sure, that was a factor. So I had the brief, was told that, you know, the man had been seen swimming out towards this post, and then his friend said he just disappeared somewhere between the shore and that post. They're not too sure where. He got into difficulty, put his hand up, I believe, and then he was gone, and no one had seen him since. And that was kind of 4 or 5 hours before we turned up. So, like I say, very much a recovery and not a rescue. So once I'd had my brief, I went to get changed, and invariably you would have on kind of dive underwear. Now, before you're thinking, you know, anything too saucy or anything, it's nothing like that. You know, if it's the summer, it's kind of thin, long sleeved, and sort of long john type bottoms with some decent socks, basically. And then you climb into your dry suit. Once you put that on, that has a neoprene neck seal and neoprene wrist seals, which keeps you dry. And our suits had hoods that were attached, so you then obviously put that on your head, and that gave you, once you were zipped into it at the back, your attendant would zip you in at the back, and that gave you a complete sealed unit. Effectively no water should get in that. The only thing that would get wet at all, if anything did, was your face. But then we wore a full face mask which fitted onto that hood, so on paper nothing at all should get wet apart from your hands, because we always wore wet gloves as opposed to dry gloves, because we needed to have some sort of feeling. You know, if you're searching, there's no point in being in there in great big huge dry gloves that you can't feel anything on the bottom. So get kitted up, you put a harness on. That harness is what your line would be attached to, and then over top of that harness you put your 2 cylinders on. Now generally, if you were on surface supply, i.e. breathing from cylinders on the surface, with a hose that came down to you. You wouldn't breathe off those cylinders on your back, but they were a backup. If your air supply failed from the shore, you had a switch up on your right shoulder that you basically just push over, and that would then enable you to breathe from your cylinders on your back. But depending on what depth you're at, that was very limited supply. Now, in shallow water, 2 or 3 meters, that might give you, an hour perhaps, if you weren't working too hard, of those cylinders in your back. But if you're at 10 meters and you were, because the deeper you go, the more oxygen or air you breathe, you get through the air quicker. So if you're at 10 meters and you're working very hard arc searching, for example, like we talked about last week, where you're constantly finning against that line to keep it tight, then you could burn through that air in, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. We had some people that we'd call sort of air pigs on the team that, would always use a lot more air than everyone else. Generally, they were bigger guys, but it didn't always follow like that. A lot of it came down to how comfortable you were in the water. If you were comfortable and relaxed in the water, you perhaps didn't breathe quite as much air, even if you were working hard finning a lot or there was tide or something. But having said that, it didn't really follow through because some of our most experienced divers were big guys that were completely calm in the water, yet they absolutely burnt through the air. So yeah, air pigs as we would call them, which I'm sure they appreciated. But banter again, as I say. So once I was kitted, the comms were tested, I was given my parameters that we would be searching between this area and this area, and it was indicated to me. And if I remember right, the plan was that where we thought the lad had gone down, they were going to stop me I think it was about 10 metres short of where they thought he was. And then I'd be worked in that arc, in that fan-like shape by finning hard against my lifeline all the time. Very hard work, as I said. And then each time I completed an arc, I'd be given 2 more metres of line, which I would take the slack up, swim tight against, and then continue in that fan over to the other sort of side, then given 2 more metres, continue the fan 2 more metres, so that we're working this fan shape, this arc shape, out until I hopefully found the body. And I say hopefully because people are going, hopefully, but like I said, you have to remember, we're there for a purpose. We're trying to complete our role. And of course, the added complication on this night was that, as we talked about last week, we had about 10 members of the family on the shore with us. And we also had local press. So we had both, moving cameras, like movie cameras effectively for the local news reporting for this missing lad. And we also had probably half a dozen still photographers, for press and independent photographers was there, as well as various members of the public, filming us on phones and things. So there's a lot of people there, and they were kept back to a degree, but we all know just how long a range, those zooms have. So you had to watch your P's and Q's, as it were, because also obviously microphones are about, so you had to be careful what you're saying. And of course, respectful to the family, the supervisor went over and spoke to the family and explained what we were doing and explained how it would work. And obviously we were hoping to get their son back, but equally, they explained that we believe he's been in the water, 3 hours. Unfortunately, people watch movies and imagine that we're going to get someone out of the water after 3 hours and start, CPR on them, and they're going to cough a couple of times like they do in the movies and then come back to life and everything will be great. I think he set out, the expectations for them quite early on, because you cannot have that scenario where, you're recovering him and they just imagine, as I say, you're going to magically bring him back to life. But people are in shock, family are in shock at that point. I think the vast majority just want their loved one back, and they realise that it's gone beyond the sort of saving them point. But yeah, he definitely had that conversation and sort of spelt it out to them fairly early on, which is harsh, of course, but, unfortunately, that's the reality of it. Obviously, like I said, in the summer, it would be a lot of swimmers, and in the winter, what we'd have quite often is dog walkers. We'd also have various drunks that we'd find with their flies open. They'd gone to basically have a wee into the water and then fallen in. In the winter, we'd have ice. Dogs would run onto the ice and go through the ice. and the dog walkers, and I've got dogs myself, I'm a dog lover, so I would probably do the same, but dog walkers then carefully go onto the ice themselves to try and get their poor pooch out of the water, and invariably the ice gives way and they go in. In every case I can think of, the dog always got out one way or another, but unfortunately the people didn't. We were limited how cold water we could dive in. 3 degrees is the accepted minimum, but at that point you'd be breaking the ice to get in. But this dive was different because it was a much warmer dive, although the water of course was still about 10 degrees, which was a constant throughout the year, apart from in the very depths of winter. So I entered the water and I turned onto my back and I finned out away from the shore, and you're on your back looking towards the supervisor because he or she will guide you in the direction, because as soon as you obviously are facing away from where you're intending to swim to, like this wooden pole that's sticking up in the water, you have no idea which way that is. So you're relying on that supervisor to give you arm signals to sort of make you swim left or right. And you keep going until they give you a stop signal. And then once they're happy, they'll tell you in the comms, and almost certainly do it with hand signals as well. They'll give you the thumbs down, which is the signal to drop to the bottom. So you leave the surface, and I remember looking back at the shore, and it was just a sea of lights because we had, it's a pitch black park. I'm in this pond, and you've got this, this sea of lights there because we've got all of our working lights, and then you've got the press doing their interviews and mobile phones with torches on and things. There's quite a lot going on. So drop to the bottom, and I take up the slack in my line, and he'll have already told me, the supervisor, that when you hit the bottom, I want you to swim to your right. So I turn to my right, and I'm at about sort of diagonal angle, and bearing in mind I'm laying on the bottom now, flat on the bottom, and I'm working both of my hands in an arc as well, left to right, with big stretches as far as I can stretch. I'm swimming hard against that line to keep it bar tight, with a slight angle to the right so that I'm going to slowly arc right. And I'm basically just waiting to bump into the body. That's what I'm doing. That is the process. There's nothing more technical about it. The technical side of it is getting the arc right and keeping the line taut, particularly if you then add in, your snags of your mopeds, your shopping trolleys and what have you. But the actual physical act of finding that body is you're waiting to swim into it in black water. And off I went, searching, hands out, sweeping, and I would go for maybe, 20 or 30 metres to the right before I'd get a big, long pull on my line, and that was a signal for me to stop. And then they would feed me 2 more metres of line, and I'd turn to my left, take up the slack in the line, and then continue back, arcing to my left, sweeping my hands. And this continued on, and you are puffing because, as I say, you're finning hard against that line all the time. And basically this continued on for probably 40 minutes, and I must have completed quite a few arcs. And I must admit, I'd lost hope at this point. I thought, if he is in here, which we assumed he was, although you never know for sure, if he is in here, I'm not going to be the diver to find it, even though I thought this was going to be my turn. I'm 40 minutes in. They'd already said to me, you're coming to the end of your dive on the comms. So I was fully expecting to be told, right, that's the end, we're sending someone else out. And that's what I thought would happen. So I thought I was probably on my last sweep. And I was going along. I had a torch with me because there was a little bit of visibility in the water, but I didn't have it on. It was only if I found anything to perhaps assist me. And as I went sweeping along on what I thought was my last sweep, my right hand just clipped something on the bottom. And I wasn't sure initially what it was, so I stopped. And as an attendant, if you're holding the line to the diver, you can tell instantly they've stopped. Now that might just be because they're clearing the line, or there's an obstruction, you're going over that shopping trolley, that moped, whatever. But quite often, even as the attendant, you kind of, the hairs on the back of your neck start to go up because you think he's found something. So I reached out, and I couldn't really make out what it was I was feeling. It was rounded, and I wasn't too sure, and I felt further up it. And in your mind, you've got your eyes shut, and you're trying to make out what this thing is that you're feeling. And then I realised it was a heel. What I could feel was this boy's heel and the back of his sort of Achilles tendon. Excuse me. So I was pretty confident I'd found him. And I say pretty confident because it's very difficult to be sure initially of what you found. And I can give you a classic example of that. When I very first started diving, and I've always had the mickey taken at me for this one. In fact, I met up with some of the retired divers the other day, and they brought this story up again because it's a great one for giving me some stick over. I found what I thought was a canoe as a very young diver, about 10 meters deep, stuck in the bottom of this mud. And I in my mind, I imagined most of it was under the mud still, but I could feel the very round shape of where you actually get into the canoe. So I called up in the comms and said, I found a canoe, send a line down and I'll send it up. So they sent this line down, and I wrapped I managed to put this line through what I imagined was the place you sit in the canoe, connect it and then send it up. And the guys hauled it up, and it took them forever because they were dragging it to the surface. When it got to the surface, they couldn't believe what they were seeing, and they called me back up. So I came up, and they were saying, and you thought this was a canoe? And what it was a large tractor tyre that had been sort of very much submerged in the mud. And to this day, I can't tell you why I didn't think it was anything other than a tyre. It's obvious. But you have to remember, I'm a new, excitable diver in pitch black water. I felt this round shape, which was clearly the inside of the tyre. But in my mind, it was a canoe. That was the connection my mind had made, and therefore that was it. I told him it was a canoe, and of course I forever got stick with, oh, brilliant diver you are, thought you found a canoe and it was a tyre. But anyway, I digress. So unfortunately, it's sometimes very difficult to figure out what it is you're feeling. But as I got hold of this guy's heel, and then I worked my way up his leg a bit, it became very apparent what I'd found. So I gave the signal, 5 bells, I've had a find, and they knew, what that meant on the shore, that I'd found him. He was face down, but he had got that face down and slightly on his side, and he'd got that slight area where he'd drawn up his legs and his arms, like we talked about last week. What was also on the bottom around him was a series of sort of scuff marks, and the water was only about 1.8 meters deep there, so he virtually could have stood up, and I suspect he tried to. And then as he was trying to stand up, his feet were sliding and skidding off the muddy bottom. But I did exactly as I discussed with my standby diver, and as we talked about last week. I turned him over and I positioned his head in between my legs, and I waited for the standby diver, who came down. He brought the tray down, and we recovered him into the tray and put the seat belts across him. And then the standby went off again and got the big stretchy cover that came back and went over top of the body and the stretcher. And then eventually we were recovered back to the shore with our stretcher. But of course, with all the press filming, the mobile phones out, and even worse, all the family there as well. Very upsetting for them. There was lots of tears and prayers. And we have to effectively hand that body over then to local officers who will have already called an undertaker who'll be on the way. And ultimately their role then is to take the body off to the local hospital, and then it becomes, the coroner's job to establish what's happened. Now, in this case, it was fairly obvious, and it probably wouldn't have been that difficult. He had drowned, but of course, in other occasions there can be foul play, so they have to look through it. But for me, having been quite frankly elated that I found him because I'd done my job, you then have this sort of quiet time where you go back to the truck and your kit's been taken off you, and now you're in the dive truck taking off your suit, and just thinking really that, as far as I was concerned, it was a job well done. We did exactly what we were asked to do, and that's all you can do. After that as well, a few, pats on the back from the guys, and I definitely felt more part of the team. And the other thing that happens then is, certainly did on my team, is you got a hat that had like a diver's helmet on it, and you only got given that hat when you'd found your first body. And again, that just, helps cement the team and make you feel part of that team, and that you were carrying out your job as you should do. So I got my hat, but yeah, thoughts were, I didn't know the lad. As I said last week, he didn't seem real to me. It just became like, a mannequin or a training exercise, because I'd done it a lot of times in training, and I just did it as I did in training, basically. And then the following day, of course, you see all the press coverage and the poor family, you know, who have to then deal with the aftermath. But for us, we just moved on to the next one, and whether that was a body or a murder weapon or a phone or a SIM card or whatever it was, we were then asked to recover. We just carried on, you know, that's what you did. And there we go. Yeah. So my first body. So hopefully you found that interesting. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Enjoyed always seems a strange word, doesn't it, when you're talking about what, you know, the subject matter that we deal with on this podcast a lot. But you know what I mean. Okay. Speak to you soon. Take it easy. Have a good week. Cheers. Bye.